You know what finally pushed me over the edge? I was rebuilding a garden gate. White oak, good lumber, nothing cheap. I pre-drilled every hole, used stainless steel screws, did everything by the book. 6 months later, I come outside and half the screws had worked themselves loose. 2 of them had split the grain right along the stile. And I'm standing there in my driveway, holding this gate that cost me more in fasteners than it did in wood, thinking there has to be a better way to hold 2 pieces of lumber together. Then I stumbled onto something that stopped me cold. Viking longships. These vessels crossed the North Atlantic, survived storms that would tear a modern boat apart, and they did it without a single screw. Not one. The hulls flexed, the joints held, and some of these ships survived in recognizable form for over 1,000 years, buried in the ground. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how Norse shipwrights fasten their vessels, and more importantly, why their approach works better than what most of us default to in the shop. Plus, stick around to the end, because I'll show you how to drive and wedge a wooden peg that locks tighter than any screw you've ever used. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about today is a fastening philosophy that's been tested harder than anything you or I will ever build. These aren't museum curiosities. These are engineering solutions that held together under conditions that would destroy a modern screw joint in a matter of weeks. And once you understand the thinking behind them, you'll start looking at every project in your shop a little differently. So let me give you some background on who these builders actually were, because this isn't just romantic history. This is practical problem solving at a level that still holds up today. When we say Viking shipwrights, we're talking about Norse craftsmen working primarily in Scandinavia from roughly the 8th century through the 11th century. These weren't guys with engineering degrees. They were tradesmen, often working in family lineages where the knowledge passed from father to son over generations. And they were solving a very specific problem. They needed vessels that could cross open ocean in brutal North Sea conditions, navigate shallow rivers, and be light enough that a crew could actually carry them overland between waterways. Now, here's the thing most people don't realize. Iron was expensive in Scandinavia during this period. They had it, but it wasn't something you wasted. Every nail, every rivet, every piece of iron hardware was made by a blacksmith one at a time. So these builders were naturally motivated to use iron only where it truly mattered and to find alternatives everywhere else. That constraint forced them to develop fastening methods that actually work with wood instead of just punching through it. The ships we can study today, the Gokstad ship from around 890 AD and the Oseberg ship from around 820 AD, both excavated from burial mounds in Norway, show us exactly how they did it. These vessels were buried in clay, which preserved the wood and the fastenings remarkably well. When archaeologists examined the construction, they found 3 distinct fastening systems working together: rivets and roves for the overlapping hull planks, wooden pegs called tree nails for structural connections, and flexible lashing made from spruce root or cordage to tie the internal frames to the hull. Each system does something different, and together they create a hull that's stronger and more resilient than anything you could build with screws. The guiding principle behind all of it is simple, and it's the thing that changed how I think about fastening. Match the fastener to how the wood moves. Don't fight the material, work with it. Let me show you how each system does exactly that. The first method is rivets and roves, and this is the backbone of clinker-built ship construction. If you've ever seen a Viking ship, you've noticed the overlapping planks running along the hull. That's clinker building. Each plank overlaps the one below it by about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, and they're fastened together with iron rivets. But these aren't rivets the way most of us think of them. Here's how it actually works. The shipwright drives a square-shanked iron nail through both overlapping planks from the outside of the hull. On the inside, a second person holds a small iron plate called a rove against the protruding nail tip. A rove is basically a small square washer, usually about 3/4 of an inch across, with a hole punched in the center just slightly smaller than the nail shank. You drive the rove down onto the nail, and then you peen the end of the nail over the rove with a hammer, mushrooming the iron so it can never pull back through. What you've created is a fastener that clamps both planks together, with the rove spreading the load across a wide area on the inside face. The nail can't back out because the peened head is wider than the rove hole, and because the shank is square, it resists rotation in the wood. It just sits there and holds. Now, think about why this beats a screw. A screw is a helical wedge. It works by cutting threads into the wood fibers and relying on friction between those threads and the surrounding grain to stay put. But wood moves, it swells, it shrinks, it cycles with the seasons. Every time the wood moves, those threads lose a little grip. That's why screws back out over time, especially in outdoor projects. The wood is literally pushing them loose with every moisture cycle. A rivet and rove doesn't care about thread friction. It's a mechanical lock. The peened head physically cannot pass back through the rove, and the rove physically cannot pass back through the wood because it's wider than the hole. There's no thread to strip, no friction to lose. The joint actually gets tighter as the wood swells because the planks press harder against the rove. I made a small clinker-built box last year just to test this, using copper nails and copper roves from a boat building supplier. The thing is rock solid. I've left it outside through 2 seasons and it hasn't moved. One detail that matters here. The nail hole is drilled just barely large enough for the shank. You want a snug fit, not a loose one, and you always drill the hole. You never just pound the nail through, because that would split the grain, which is exactly the problem we're trying to avoid. The second method is tree nails, and honestly, this is the one that changed my thinking the most. A tree nail, sometimes pronounced trunnel, is simply a wooden peg used as a fastener. The Norse shipwrights used them extensively for attaching structural members like knees and braces to the hull planking and frames. Here's what makes a tree nail brilliant. It's made of wood, the same material as the thing it's holding together. That means it expands and contracts at roughly the same rate as the surrounding timber. When the wood swells with moisture, the tree nail swells too, and it actually grips tighter in its hole. When the wood dries and shrinks, the tree nail shrinks with it, maintaining its relative fit. A metal screw doesn't do this. Metal and wood move at completely different rates, which is exactly why screw holes elongate over time and fasteners work loose. The Norse builders typically made their tree nails from oak when fastening oak planking, or sometimes from willow or birch for softer timbers. The peg is split from straight-grained stock, never sawn, because splitting follows the grain and produces a stronger peg. A typical tree nail for ship construction might be 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 inch in diameter, driven into a hole drilled just barely undersized, maybe 1/32 of an inch smaller than the peg. You chamfer the leading end of the peg slightly so it starts into the hole, and then you drive it home with a wooden mallet. The fit should be snug enough that you feel resistance the entire way, but not so tight that you're crushing the fibers. Once it's seated, you saw it flush on both sides, and then split a small wedge into the exposed end grain. That wedge expands the peg inside the hole, creating a mechanical lock similar to what the rove does for the rivet. It physically cannot pull back out. Now here's what amazed me. I drove a tree nail into a test joint last spring, just a simple oak peg and an oak mortise, and left it outside. After a heavy rain, I tried to knock it out with a hammer and a drift pin. It wouldn't budge. The peg had swollen and sealed itself into the hole so tightly that it was essentially part of the wood. No glue, no epoxy, no screw. Just oak holding oak. The other advantage tree nails have over screws is that they never rust. I know stainless steel screws are supposed to solve that problem, but if you've ever pulled a stainless screw out of white oak after a few years, you've seen the black staining from the tannic acid reacting with the metal. Tree nails don't react with anything because they are the same material as the surrounding wood. There's nothing to corrode, nothing to stain, nothing to weaken over time. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third method is the one that seems the most counterintuitive at first, and it's the one that made me realize just how sophisticated these builders really were. Lashing. The Norse shipwrights tied their internal frames to the hull planking using flexible cordage, most commonly spruce root that had been split and soaked until it was supple and strong. Now, when I first learned this, I thought it sounded like a compromise, like they ran out of iron and had to improvise, but it's the exact opposite. Lashing is a deliberate engineering choice, and here's why. A Viking longship in open ocean doesn't stay rigid. The hull flexes. Waves hit from different angles, the bow rises, the stern drops, and the whole structure is constantly twisting and bending by small amounts. If you bolt the internal ribs to the hull with rigid iron fasteners, those fasteners become stress concentration points. Every time the hull flexes, the rigid fastener resists the movement, and something has to give. Either the fastener bends, the wood splits around it, or the joint fails entirely. Lashing solves this by allowing deliberate movement at the joint. The spruce root cordage has natural elasticity. It lets the frame shift slightly relative to the hull plank, absorbing the stress instead of concentrating it. The joint moves without breaking, flexes without failing, and actually distributes force across the entire length of the lashing rather than focusing it on a single point the way a screw or bolt would. This is the same principle behind why a wooden fence post with a flexible connection at the rail will outlast one with a rigid, bolted joint. The flexible joint lets the wood move where it needs to move. The rigid joint cracks. What really struck me was learning that the lashing holes in the hull planks were not drilled through the plank face. They were carved through raised cleats that were left proud on the inner surface of the plank during the shaping process. The plank and the cleat are one piece of wood. This means the lashing point is integral to the plank itself, not a hole that weakens the cross-section. The Norse builders were thinking about structural integrity at every single step. Once I understood lashing, I started looking at my own projects differently. I had a workbench with a rigid, bolted stretcher that kept cracking at the bolt holes every winter when the wood shrank. I replaced the bolts with a pegged and wedged tenon that allows a tiny amount of seasonal movement, and the cracking stopped completely. Same principle, let the joint move instead of fighting it. Now that you understand these three systems, let me share the bigger principle that ties them all together, because this is really the takeaway that will change how you work. Every one of these fastening methods is designed around one idea. Match the fastener to how the wood behaves. Rivets and roves spread the load across a wide area so the wood isn't fighting a single point of stress. Tree nails match the wood's expansion and contraction so the fastener and the structure move as one. Lashing allows deliberate flex so the joint absorbs stress instead of concentrating it. A modern screw does none of these things. A screw is a rigid metal point driven into soft, moving fibers. It concentrates stress at the threads. It moves at a different rate than the wood, and it resists flex at the joint. That's why screws strip, rust, split the grain, and work themselves loose. It's not that screws are bad tools. They're incredibly convenient, but they're not always the right answer, and most of us use them as the default for everything, because that's what we were taught. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself, that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for a screw every time two pieces of wood need to join. I did this for decades. If it needed to be held together, I drilled a pilot hole and drove a screw. But what the Norse builders understood is that a screw is only one type of fastener, and it's often the wrong type for wood that moves. Once I started thinking about whether the joint needed to be rigid or flexible, load spreading or point loaded, I started choosing fasteners differently. The second pattern is over-relying on screw length for strength. A lot of us think a longer screw means a stronger joint, but a longer screw just means more thread engagement in fibers that are going to move seasonally. The Norse approach teaches that fastener strength comes from how the load is distributed, not from how deep you drive the fastener. A properly set rivet and rove in 3/4-inch planking is stronger than a 3-inch screw in the same material. The third pattern is treating rust as an inevitable nuisance instead of a design problem. We buy stainless screws, we buy coated screws, we buy ceramic-coated screws, and we're still fighting corrosion. The tree nail eliminates the problem entirely by removing metal from the equation. For outdoor projects especially, a wooden peg that swells tight and never corrodes is often the smarter choice. The fourth pattern is building rigid joints where flexible ones would last longer. Not every connection in a project needs to be locked solid. Tabletops need to move across their width. Outdoor structures need to accommodate seasonal swelling. The Norse lashing principle, building in deliberate flex, is something most of us never even consider because we've been trained to make everything as tight and rigid as possible. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. You don't have to build a longship. You just have to start asking yourself whether a screw is really the best answer for the joint in front of you. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a simple technique for driving and wedging a tree nail that you can use on your very next project, and it works beautifully for outdoor furniture, timber frames, or any joint where you want a fastener that will never rust or loosen. Start with straight-grained oak or white oak. Split a peg from a small billet using a froe or even a heavy chisel. Don't saw it. Splitting follows the grain and gives you a peg that's dramatically stronger than a sawn dowel. Shape it roughly round with a block plane or a draw knife, aiming for about 3/8 of an inch in diameter for most furniture scale work. Chamfer the leading end just slightly so it'll start into the hole. Drill your hole 1/32 of an inch, smaller than the finished peg diameter. Drive the peg in with a wooden mallet until it seats firmly and you feel solid resistance. Saw it flush on the exit side. Now, here's the key. Take a thin wedge of the same oak, maybe 1/16 of an inch thick at the wide end, and tap it into a small kerf you've sawn into the end grain of the peg. Drive it just until you feel the peg expand slightly in the hole. That wedge locks the peg mechanically so it cannot pull back, and when moisture hits it, the whole assembly swells together and seals itself watertight. I've been using this on every outdoor project for the last 3 years, and I haven't replaced a single peg. Meanwhile, the screws in my neighbor's deck are popping up every spring. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. Here's what I want to leave you with. The Vikings didn't have better materials than we do. They had worse materials by modern standards. What they had was a better understanding of how wood actually behaves, and they designed their fasteners around that understanding instead of against it. Every time you pick up a screw, just ask yourself one question. Is this the right fastener for how this wood is going to move? If the answer is no, you've got 1,000 years of proven alternatives to choose from. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. I'll see you in the next video.